Welcome back to the Sun and Moon Sober Living podcast. This is an inclusive space where we dive into many themes related to addiction recovery and holistic sober living. My name is Mary Tilson, your host, and today's guest is Charles Gosset. Charles is a life purpose coach, certified addiction recovery coach, and the founder of Full Integration Coaching. He is someone who is really living his message in a powerful way. In this episode, we talk about how Charles's personal battle with addiction nearly cost him everything he cherishes in life, namely his family, and the lessons which came out of his recovery journey and inform the work he does today. So whether you're someone who's personally struggling or have a loved one in active addiction, there is so much insight to gain from this episode. So let's get into the conversation. Hi, Charles. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Mary.
So you cover such an important topic with your work on purpose for everyone, really, but particularly I feel for people in recovery. So I thought we could start off with you just sharing, what does living on purpose mean to you?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me on the show. I'm really excited. I've listened to the first episode as of the time of our conversation. It dropped, and I was inspired, and I've been telling other people about it. So it's an honor to be here.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, sure. So, yeah, for me, purpose it's core to who I am and how I am in the world. It's something that all people need. And those of us that are fortunate enough to be able to have a sense of purpose and meaning in our lives, life is better, generally speaking. It's been shown in recent times to matter maybe as much as ever, or maybe more than ever, with COVID and all of the turmoil that has been going on in our world. People have really been looking inward and taking a second look about what matters most in their life, and are they aligned with a sense of meaning and purpose in their life and in their work. What I've personally found most rewarding or important about purpose for myself is that it was something I was disconnected from in my active addiction. And so as a person in long-term recovery from alcoholism, I just remember the many, many times throughout my 16-year career of active addiction, feeling disconnected and separated from what I knew to be true, what I knew to be good, and what I knew to be possible in this world. And so many, many times I can remember events that had happened where I would have certain behaviors and actions, and I'd wake up the next day and think, who is this person? And I'd really lost that sense of who I am. And for me, I'm ultra wired to want to connect with whatever that is internally. That's how I am made in this world. And so to be disconnected from that was really an existential crisis for many, many years. So in short, purpose is what makes life fulfilling. It's what gives me a sense of motivation, whether things are hard or whether they're not. It's intrinsic motivation. And it's an evolving science. The science of purpose is an emerging field that has some interesting things to show. So that's a little bit of a snapshot. I will say, for people that are like, I'm not sure I'm going to listen to the rest of this because it's about purpose and I don't know what mine is. Let me offer some consolation right now. A lot of us don't necessarily know what our big life purpose is. And the good news is that you can have purpose at any point in your life, including today. So I can talk more about that later as time allows, but just know that it's not necessarily an overarching, big, intimidating life purpose. Either I have it or I don't, but you can actually do things on a daily basis to help you sense more fulfillment, more meaning, and more purpose in your lived experience.
That's beautiful. And what was your experience? You mentioned that you've struggled with addiction in the past. Did you find that you had purpose at one point in your life and then it had been lost and you rediscovered it? Or do you see purpose as something as that's a fixed thing, or something that ebbs and flows and can change throughout a person's life?
I believe that it can be fixed for some people. And the more that I am in this line of work, the more rare that I find that to be. There are people who know from a very young age, for example, and maybe you know some of them in your own life and in your own work, where they're like, I knew what I wanted to do the time that I was 8 years old, and here's the moment that it happened. And they just go do that thing, and they go become that person or whatever that is for them. That's not the norm as far as I've been able to tell. It tends to be something that's more elusive and that actually changes with the changes that happen in the seasons of life that we go through. So, in the instance, back to your question of recovery from addiction, I knew that I had purpose at one point. What had happened was my actions more and more were out of line with my value system. What I knew to be true about myself, like my self view, my self narrative, the most important values that I had in life, I was able to act on those and be conscious of those some of the time. But with addiction, our brains are literally hijacked. And the new priority, the new value, so to speak, the new purpose becomes pursuing that addiction, whatever that happens to be. All addictions act the same way. And that became my new identity. And you know what? I really didn't like it. I didn't set out to become an alcoholic. And with enough years behind me, I can look back and think, nope, I didn't need that. That's not what I set out to become. When I
Yeah.
was 8 years old, I didn't say, I want to drink way too much and get sick and do bad things. That was not my plan. But at the same time, I have a more honest, I think, integrated view of myself more and more these days. And there were times, even in the midst and the throes of alcoholic addiction, that I still had a sense of meaning and purpose. It wasn't always gone. It's just when I was disconnected from it and not in line with my values, even though I was doing great work in the community, for example, even though I had a few friendships, it was that private hell that we go through, that many of us go through in addiction, that really caused me to lose hope, lose a sense of meaning, lose my compass or my bearing in life. And that's where I started to disconnect more and more from purpose.
And what was it that helped you come back to that? I mean, was it just sort of like a light bulb switch that went off? Or, when you were in active addiction, what helped you come back?
During active addiction, I would say I'm going to give credit to my wife and my
Mhm.
my support team, which would be my family, but really my wife. Shout out to Christy, who is a public school teacher in the U.S. in Oklahoma, and you know, she's incredible. And what happened? My wife gave me love and support unconditionally, which she will admit, she's given me permission to say this, was at times codependent and unhealthy and enabling behavior. But what happened in our relationship is Christy found out about Al-Anon. And so anybody that has a family member that's listening in who's in active addiction, or even if they're in recovery,
Mhm.
Al-Anon and related social support groups are really recommended. I personally recommended. The reason being, my wife learned through Al-Anon and through her own recovery and working the 12 steps of Al-Anon related to the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. Al-Anon is for friends and family of loved ones who suffer from alcoholism. And at first they go and they think it's so that they can help their alcoholic to get sober. That's what most Al-Anon members think
Mm,
when they go, right? This is going to help them. Finally, I'm going to be able to fix them. Finally, I'm going to be able to control them or
yeah.
to love them enough. As a therapist friend of mine said recently, if your love for your alcoholic or addict in your life would have fixed them, it would have already done so years ago.
Mm,
And so, it's beyond love. It's really understanding the family nature of addiction. And so, long story short, Christy learned about codependency and enabling. and learned through the 12 steps in sponsorship how to stop doing it. And so when I came home and had drunk a pint of whiskey on the way home from work, which was a very public position, and I'm drinking a pint of whiskey on the way home in a 10-minute drive, I am completely getting ready to be completely drunk in about 20 minutes once that hits. And a case in point, she answers the door one day and says, "Hey, how did it go?" And that's what our loved ones always say when we come home from work or, a tough meeting or whatever, and we're in the throes of addiction. And I said, "Fine, but I think I may need a couple beers tonight." And the slur had started. The reason I share this story, it was a turning point because at that point, Christy said, "Okay." And she turned around and let me in. And she went on and did something else. It was very supportive and loving. But what I learned later is that was detachment with love. She had
Mm.
started to disconnect from the addiction and to take care of our daughters and herself, call her sponsor. And that really helped me in the end, towards the end of my addiction. Once she left with our two daughters because it was too much for her, that was the hardest thing she did. And I think the best thing in our case, because that allowed me to see the true nature of my addiction. And so that's where real recovery began for me, was really when a loved one left and said, "Enough is enough."
Wow. Yeah, that's incredible. And I think there's, a lot of people enter into Al-Anon or these support groups trying to understand how they can be a better support for other people and realize a lot of the things that might be our default or what might feel really natural are actually not necessarily the most effective. And so I wonder, in terms of, I think environment is so influential in people's quality of life. With the work that you do you think that, our environment is supporting people in living a healthy, balanced life and living a purposeful life? Or do you think that there are things that collectively need to shift in order for us to all feel, to live free from addiction, to live a healthy, balanced life, to find purpose?
I think that the work that you and I and others like us that are doing across the continuum of care, and for those that don't know that term, the continuum of care is just all the support and expertise and help that people in active addiction and then in active recovery can gain access to from the start all the way through into advanced recovery, from the start of chaos into better living. Along the continuum of care, everything that we're doing collectively and collaboratively is helping, is everything that we're doing and providing the ultimate environment or the best lifescape, for people to recover. Not necessarily, and it's a case by case. But specifically here in Oklahoma City, I am in a new kind of relationship through my business, which is called full integration coaching. And I'm not overselling my services, but I have a really interesting relationship professionally with an addiction treatment facility called Stages of Recovery. I had already been in business. I've been doing my work as a purpose coach for like 7 years. And then I added the addiction recovery piece over the last year and a half, especially with COVID. That was the tipping point for me. I said, I want to help. I want to do more. And since then, I've been rubbing shoulders with other addiction treatment specialists, therapists, counselors, treatment centers, residential, intensive outpatient, all kinds of folks, other recovery coaches, peer support. There's lots of terms out there. But this place, Stages of Recovery, specifically in Oklahoma City, is an intensive outpatient program, meaning they're really designed to work with people primarily who have gone to a residential addiction treatment center for a number of days, or months, and they're transitioning to that next level of care along the continuum of care. So it's a continuity. Uh, Addiction professionals recommend at least 1 year 3 years is better of continued care for those that are recovering from addictions. And stages of recovery and others like them offer intensive outpatient care. So that's like 3 nights a week, 3 hours a week of like group counseling, re-socializing, learning how to be yourself again with others like you, but still living the life that you're living. So you're reintegrating into your life, into your community. And so you might also be in like a transitional living house or sober living. So anyway, the role that I'm playing here, I was invited by the owners to share office space through my business as a professional recovery coach, which would be like the next stage or level of care after intensive outpatient treatment. So I'm not a therapist like they are. They're therapists and social workers. I'm not. I'm non-clinical, but it's providing that additional support, digging deep and finding out, well, who are you now that you're at this place in recovery? What are your values? Those are things I wanted to know from someone. What are your strengths? What did you know to be true about yourself and the world you live in? And what are you doing to bring more meaning and joy into your life? Because those are the things that keep people like me sober and content. And so it's really an opportunity to reduce stigma. You asked what else we could be doing, reducing stigma. There's still a lot of messaging out there in the world. I know in the US for sure about addiction and mental illness, mental health as well. And this organization and mine are both committed to flattening that curve and saying, let's just have a conversation about our humanity through the lens of addictive disorders or through the lens of mental health disorders. You're still who you are. You're still fully human. And so we're
Yeah.
really inviting those conversations. And in Oklahoma, that's not happening as much. It's happening some. So there's an opportunity for more.
Yeah, that idea of humanizing addiction is so important. And that's why, I love you. I know you love to share conversations on your podcast. That's really why I wanted to bring on all different types of people to tell their stories, just to remind people that, there's not one look. We see the stigmatization of addiction shown in one particular way a lot of the times. But of course, we know that's not really the case. And, you talked about the stages of recovery. I thought it would be really helpful for you to kind of personalize that for people by sharing, if you don't mind, what the stages of recovery have looked like for you. And do you see it now that you're at the completion, or is it something that's more circular?
I think I'm a more circular person. So I think it's like a spiral or a circle. So, for me, let me just answer the last part first. No, I'm not at the end. I believe that I believe all addictions, but especially substance use disorder, alcohol use disorder, chemicals, and most behaviors are chronic, that this is a chronic condition and it's a medical condition increasingly at our hospitals and in our psychological, in our therapist's office, in psychological circles. It's more and more being treated as something that's along the lines of diabetes or heart conditions or cancer. It's not the same thing, but it's falling more and more into that medical model of understanding. And that's where I'm going with it in the way that I coach. I believe that it's a brain disease. It's psychosocial. It's something that affects others. Anyone we're in relationship with is bound to be affected, which is kind of unique. But with continued care over the lifetime of the victim, of the individual with the disorder or addiction, then a continued standard of life or way of living remains possible. And not only possible, but probable. So receiving great care and continuing to do the things that we know we need to do are going to keep us in a place of satisfying, comfortable recovery. So that's the last part first. I'm not done.
It was a big question, I know.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. So if you want to jump in, please do right there. Any thoughts on that?
I completely agree. Yeah, I think maybe one of the biggest pitfalls that happens sometimes is and I know this from myself, you trick yourself into thinking you flip a switch, you give up the substance, and and that's it, you're recovered. But the reality is it's more about there's something deeper underlying. And that something is not also something that you can just uproot, but it's something that needs to be worked on and nurtured on a daily basis, really, and in the support of community. So I completely agree with that. And I think it's really important for people to understand that. So thank you.
Yeah, no, me too. So, for me, there was along the same lines there. I want to say this too, that it was a moment. It seemed like it was a moment to me that I had in my first 2 years of active recovery, that there was a mindset switch that happened just as a result of working the steps and digging into spirituality and working with my sponsor and going to meetings and doing all the things that help to support a quality recovery. Where one day I just had the realization that I have alcoholism. I am alcoholic. I believe that statement to be true even today. I
How did you
still
come?
have the illness,
Sorry to
but
interrupt you. How did you
no, that's
come to
okay.
that realization? Because that's a really difficult and it's a really big one.
It is. But the other side of that, 2 years in, a year and a half in, I am alcoholic, but I am not an alcoholic.
Mm.
So it's a real subtle difference in language. But for me, what that means is I have this thing called alcoholism. There's no denying that. I cannot think my way around it. There's no winning that game. Zero sum game. I will have it for the rest of my life. That's done for today. I believe that to be true. However, my identity as an alcoholic, as a primary identity to who I am, is no longer true. That is not my core identity. And so what I'm describing is spiritual freedom, and when that happened, I thought, what is this? I was looking around me and listening to people share at meetings, and I'm like, something's different. I'm just feeling a little bit of release. And it's really a release of like the ego, like that small sense of who I am. I'm like, who am I now that I know I still have the thing, but I'm not doing the thing. So I have more freedom than I had allowed myself to. And it was quite a moment. So, but in the beginning, how could I even begin to say that, yes, I am an alcoholic. I have this thing. I am alcoholic. Uh, Education helped, but really drinking and being around people that cared, that helped. So destructive drinking and people that gave a shit about me, that was a winning combination. So from the time I was 10 or 12, I was in therapy. I didn't belong. I had extreme anxiety, depression. It wasn't diagnosed necessarily at that time. Didn't know how to treat it if it was. And then about the age of 15 or 16, I had more than enough alcohol to produce intoxication. And for me, I believe this to be true. I don't know it is, but I believe that probably from that moment, that had flipped a switch for me. That I was going to be pursuing alcohol as a primary aim. And so I knew that I was getting drunk once or twice a month and once or twice a week, and then waiting. I can't wait for the weekend, which is kind of a normal thought, but wait for the weekend to do what? To get drunk. Right. And so the more that I drank, the more that I wanted to drink. And that's usually a good indication that you're on to problematic drinking. But really, it wasn't until I started to experience consequences. So those are like the stages of addiction. Like, hey, this is fun. That's the first one. This is interesting. I'm doing it to be social. Then the next one is like, I'm doing it to cope. I'm doing it to get away. I'm drinking more, like a lot of folks have during COVID, just because I'm so in so much emotional turmoil. I don't have the skills to deal with it. I'm not around enough people to support me. But back then, I was like, it was a coping tool. Until the next phase, I was like, man, I'm really edgy without it. So it's like, the onset of early withdrawal symptoms, and I kind of needed it. It was being wired into my body and in my brain. And then finally, that last stage is the consequences, the negative consequences that started happening. We could probably spend the rest of the show, along with most of us, talking about all of those. I had them. Okay. So jail, hospitals, psychiatric institution, suicide attempt. That's a snapshot. Not everybody has those stories, but whatever anybody's is, those are the general phases. And it's that last phase when we keep doing the thing, keep drinking alcohol, keep smoking, keep injecting, keep doing the behavior, despite the experiencing negative consequences. That's full-blown addiction. Now, you should get with somebody to help diagnose that, a professional, a specialist to diagnose, but we can usually self-diagnose pretty accurately if we can be honest about that stage. So that was about 10 years of that stage for me, and it was rough. And then 5 of those 10 years, I knew that something was wrong, and it had something to do with drinking, and it was probably alcoholism, but it wasn't. I hadn't accepted that deep enough. And those were hell on earth. Those years were brutal, and I was trying to stop. So that's, that was more evidence, more clarity, going to meetings, going to therapy, staying sober a couple of days, and then just some ridiculous behavior, or waking up so sick from the night before. And I had a responsibility that I missed, or was so sick that I did it anyway, and it was rough. So finally, it was through all of those things, all those experiences, and great therapy, residential treatment. I went twice to 30-day programs. And then finally, I went to that second 30-day program. This was in 2 consecutive years. Okay. Not uncommon. Just because it doesn't work, quote unquote, the first time doesn't mean it didn't help.
Oh, thank you for
Second,
saying that.
and we'll come back to that. I'll end with that because that is really important. That second time I went through, this time, my wife, God bless you, Christy, and I mean that, she was not ready for me to come back home, right? So married with 2 young kids, almost 3 and almost 1-year-old. And she said, no, I'm not ready, but there's some options for you. Sober living's one of them. And so I did that. I chose that. And it was not easy for me. I was really pissed and really lonely, and thought, when is this ever going to get better? But I did that. And so I'll close here. That's when real, active, true recovery took hold for me. I think many of the things before were helpful, but that's where it started to stick for me for a little bit of time. And I went to sober living, and I knew that this was real, and I had to learn how to live on life's terms without the substance, and just come what may. I don't know if she would ever be ready, missed our daughter's first birthday. She cried over that. That was so hard for her to say no. We were not back together. We were separated. But after 5 months, she said, okay. And we were both ready. So it gave her time to work through the steps of Al-Anon, to talk with therapists and her friends and sponsors and family, and me to do the same. And we came back, and we're back together. We've been married all that time. So it can work that way. It doesn't always have to. But back to that point, that just because it doesn't work the first time, residential treatment doesn't mean it didn't help. Yeah. What are your thoughts on that? Because
yeah, I mean, I completely agree. As someone, I mean, I've went to outpatient treatment twice, and the first, I went the first time and it didn't last. I pretty much, I also was not in a place of surrender. I kind of went through that experience thinking in my head, yeah, I can't, I'm a little bit different. Like, I'm too young to be carrying on my entire life sober. Like, this is really helpful, and I'll go back and I'll moderate, which is really embarrassing to say. And I had so much shame and fear that I wasn't even sitting, in group therapy with people who are so vulnerable about their own stories and so supportive and so honest. I couldn't even talk about the extent to my substance use and some of my behaviors because number one, the shame. And number two, because I thought if I'm honest, this might mean that they might change their decision. Because I was in university. I was at the University of Boulder at the time. And I thought maybe my therapist will change his opinion if I can actually go back to school. Because I had to leave school to do outpatient treatment while living with my family in Chicago. And I thought, maybe he won't actually let me go back to school. So I'll just tone this down a bit, which is crazy. And yeah, I mean, but then when I think about that, and there's a saying which I reference a lot, there's nothing worse than a mind full of AA and a belly full of booze, because
Oh
it was
yeah.
very difficult for me to know what I learned. I learned so much, not only from, the education that you get in those treatment facilities, but from the people and the different stories and how different we all were, yet how similar our circumstances were. It became so clear to me that this is not about me. This is not that something that I haven't done good enough or that I can get better at. So I think deep down, I knew that. And because I had that experience, and I'd be, interested to know if this was the same for you with your path, there have been some ups and downs. I knew where to return to. And because I went back and in some ways my behaviors worsened, but I also had this knowledge. I had the tools and resources. At that time I had started to get into yoga and meditation and mindfulness. So it was this foundation that I could fall back on. And when I was ready to go and commit myself to the program, I was ready to go full in. Like I knew exactly what it took. And I recognized that, I was ready to surrender. So I think it's really important for people to know that, because I think, if you make the commitment or you make the attempt, let's say, to get sober the first time, and you go to an AA meeting or you go to a sober group, a treatment facility, it's important to know that you haven't failed. If there is a slip up or a relapse, that can just lead to so much additional shame.
Mhm.
So I just wanted to reinforce that for people, that it's not like a one and done. You haven't failed if it didn't work perfectly the first time. And like hearing your story that, even after you went through all that, your wife still wasn't ready at that point. And, that's perfectly fair for her, because it sounds like, I mean, we don't know the extent of what you two went through, but
Yeah, well, let's take some time. No, I can just point in that direction. We went through a lot. So, to be candid, in those last few years of my drinking, I did a lot of drinking at home, and so somebody's heart just dropped out there that knows what that looks like in their family dynamic. It is not pretty, and so not violent, although I had violent outbursts, but mostly depressive and hopeless. And I can't believe I'm doing this again. And then there's my caretaker that used to be my wife. You hear what I'm saying? That her role had switched so much. And we still had the love. It was there, but it had really morphed and transformed our relationship, the addiction, that is. And that wasn't a healthy relationship anymore. It was not possible to have a healthy relationship with those dynamics, because I'm saying, again, there's some trauma here, so a warning to the listeners, but I'm saying, I don't know that I'm going to live through the night. And I'm a person who does what they say, and I can be over the top some, but I meant it. And I meant that not every night, but on several occasions over many years. And so that's what it was like. But it was also this person who's talking to you now. So it was this weird combination of, sometimes I could be sort of like this, but not as happy, not as joy filled, not as resilient, but sort of like this. And then enter alcohol and forget that. Then it's misery, and I'm going to bring you with me because this is so painful, and alcohol's not working like it used to. And that's when it gets real really dangerous. It's like your substance doesn't work anymore. So absolutely, to your point though, yeah, whatever it is in the continuum of care that anyone is involved with, this is what I say: as long as you can learn from it, as long as you can learn from it and really express what you've learned. You need to know what you learned, because alcoholism and addiction are diseases of denial. If they are diseases of anything, they hijack our brains. Our brain is going to tell us, don't let them know, because then I'm not going to get my thing. And I really want the thing. And then the better part of us, that is more empowered, says, well, yeah, but that's terrible for me. And then addiction says really loud, no, I want the thing, do whatever it takes. So, well, whatever wherever you're at along the continuum of care, it's whatever you can learn. So if there's relapse and you've had one recently, for example, anyone listening, then that doesn't mean failure. You may be, I say this to the folks I serve, you may be experiencing shame and guilt and frustration and self-condemnation and anger at others. Okay, that's all normal. Welcome to the humanity that is an addiction. That all belongs. Now what? So it's really about, what did you learn and what are you going to do? So anytime somebody's in relapse and they don't need medical care, it's always, what did you learn and what do you need to fine tune? And you need to do it right away. So it's really immediate action that needs to take place in that zone. And for me, it did. I was like, I called myself into treatment to the place I knew to go. And then from there, I went to sober living. I knew about the steps. I knew about therapy. But this time, it was part of my process of getting well. And by the way, I'll insert here that in many medical conditions, the relapse rate is similar. So meaning, like with diabetes, I don't have the numbers, unfortunately, right in front of me, but they're comparable. So if we can talk about addiction as a medical condition, then comparing it to others is reasonable. And those that have diabetes don't always eat right, even when they know better. They have patterns of behavior that are hard, and maybe some wiring in the brain, and they get rewards from the unhealthy foods that they've eaten. So, they might get a little bit of judgment from the medical professions and from some of their family, but oftentimes not the same as addiction. So I just invite listeners, please try to reframe, or, it's an invitation to rethink about the medical model of addiction. And it's a continuum of care. It's a journey, and it takes time for most of us to get there.
Thank you so much for that reframe. I actually had a conversation just the other day with a woman, Sarah Drage, who lost her father to alcoholism. And I was amazed at hearing some of the stories. Of course, we know that stigma exists in our society. It's everywhere. We hear about it all the time. I think anyone could think of examples of this, but as it relates to addiction, that is. But hearing that even that exists within the medical field in some ways, and people will encounter that from their own doctors. She spoke about being at the hospital in her father's last moments, and people vocally complaining that somebody with alcoholism was taking up space in the hospital, which I just found to be so disheartening. And do you find that, within, there's so many different areas of care for people with addiction. We think of traditional treatment facilities, as well as, coaching and all of these different things. But do you think that there is a gap between, maybe you're in the medical field, where people don't necessarily treat addiction as they might treat, other illnesses, which you just referenced, and for that reason, it's still kind of looked at as, you did this to yourself?
Right. And I think one of the beliefs around that thought and that response by certain professionals is oftentimes something like this: you have the choice over what you choose to do, and you chose this, and this is where it gets you, and still you keep doing it. Where the truth of addiction is, at some point we do not have the choice.
Mm.
Literally. That's why I love the term that ICARE, the International Center for Addiction and Recovery Education, which we both, I think, both been trained through. Um, they talk about this idea of the brain being hijacked. And so literally our brains are operating different. And without going into all the neuroscience of it, it's just rewired. You know, what we want and what we feel that we need to do and what we value is not what we would have without the substance
Mm.
taking priority. So it completely reorients our value system. Our survival instinct is more like, I need a drink instead of I need to eat, for
Mm.
example. So I often invite people to think about it that way. Well, just think about if you had to drink and you didn't want to drink, and you had to choose between that and eating, and you chose to drink because you didn't have a choice that you knew of. So in the beginning, yes, we have a choice before addiction takes place. We have a choice. Oh, this is fun. And then maybe there's a little period of time where we think maybe this is over the line and I'm doing this too much. That's the zone to stop if you can. If you think you have a problem, you probably do. So that's the opportunity. If you're sober curious, for example, take action on that. Just give it a whirl, an experiment to see. You know, I work with sober curious as well. So you don't have to be in the throes of addiction and then in full blown recovery. You can be like, maybe I don't want to do this anymore, but how do I stop? You know, I want to do something. It's with better behaviors. It's with finding fun that's not in drinking or using. So that's a big explanation, but I think that mindset and that belief system is really important to address. The other thing is that there are just biases that are out there. You know, people, maybe they have someone in their family sometimes who's an addict, and they have these inherited beliefs about that individual that are displaced, and they just, all addicts are the same. They're never going to get any better. That's one of the beliefs. Here they are again. That can go for smokers too. Nicotine, those that have a nicotine use disorder, that are addicted to nicotine. I volunteered in a local hospital for 3 years when I was in recovery as a way to give back to the world. And I saw several folks come in with lung disease and emphysema, and COPD. And from several of my volunteers and other health professional friends, I would hear those statements. Oh, they just keep smoking. Well, they're addicted to nicotine is why they keep smoking. So that's a good example of those later stages of the cycle of addiction.
Thank you for that. Yeah, it's so important to have that compassionate view. And, I also, have so much compassion for people who are in the position such as your wife and people who have loved ones. And it is extremely difficult for them too, and what would you say? Maybe your wife has shared some perspective on this, or just from the work that you do. How can people who are in that place of just such frustration and feeling that, why are you doing this to yourself? Why are you doing this to our family? And they love that person, but they feel that natural anger and frustration. Like, how can people take care of themselves while also, fulfilling this desire to be a loving, supportive, compassionate person to that
Yeah.
to
Well,
that loved
first,
one?
yeah. Yeah. First of all, it's really, really hard. So I'm just going to be honest. You know, it's not easy. And the situations are different. The circumstances are different. So, for example, when a loved one may have a co-occurring disease or disorder, yeah, very often, that, like for me, depression, that means like I had a mental health diagnosis plus substance use disorder. So depression, anxiety, plus alcoholism. And you put those together and they do not mix well over time, especially in those later stages. That's why it was so miserable for me. It makes perfect sense. Those are terrible combinations in the long term. But yeah, for general tips, I talk to a lot of parents. In fact, there's an organization in our state called Parents Helping Parents, and they're a nonprofit organization. And I speak with them often, as so do other folks in the community here along the continuum of care. And I'm giving a talk at the time of our interview next week on speaking of addiction, I've titled it. And it's how to maintain communication and relationships in the midst of a child's substance use. And that's going to be the first thing I say. It's not easy, and it depends. It depends on what's going on. So, but in general speaking, it's important to get support. If a loved one has what you think is addiction or substance use disorder, or even mental health disorder of some kind, you cannot manage it on your own. You can't love them enough. You can't hate them enough. You can't fix them enough. And you sure can't cure them enough. Even if you have licenses and specialties, there's something about the family dynamic that just prevents that from happening. You are playing a role that you probably don't even know you're playing. And that's how addiction works. So get support, reach out to people you know that you can trust and that have some expertise. So that's the second tip. Get some education, learn about addiction, learn about it from trusted sources, learn about it from professionals in the field, hire a therapist, work from somebody that's a licensed drug and alcohol counselor that understands family dynamics and family systems so that you can get educated. And what you'll probably find is like, oh my goodness, I didn't know. And that's a lot of things family members say. They're like, I didn't realize I was doing that. I didn't know what codependency was. I didn't know I was enabling this person. I thought I was loving them. An example of what that might look like is enabling giving money to someone with, say, a heroin use disorder. So they've been using heroin. They're saying they need something to eat, or that they need to get their car out of being impounded, or whatever the case may be. There's probably more to the story if they're active in their addiction. And ultimately, it's probably going to feed some part of their addiction. And that's not helpful. So you probably need to work with a professional on this, with a therapist, on how to set those boundaries with somebody in active addiction. But it can be done. It's hard, but that's what my wife did. So that's an example. She was working with a therapist, going to a support group, Al-Anon in her case. And she had support, encouragement. She was empowered, and she was like, I'm not going to react to this, but I'm going to have boundaries, and I'm going to say no. And I'm going to set myself up for success, whether he makes it or not. So that would be the third thing. Take care of yourself, meaning live your life. If your life is so caught up in the life of your loved one, in their addiction, you've lost your identity and who they are, that can be a sign of codependency, where you've lost who you are. You're feeling their feelings. You're trying to live for them. And you've forgotten that that's what you started doing. You forgot the game. And you've become that version of yourself. And really, that's not going to help them. That's not going to help them. And so it's hurting both of you. So regardless of what your loved one does, that next tip would be live your life. Learn how to live with some level of acceptance of what addiction is. Okay, it's not easy. It's the hardest part. It's the hardest part, along with detaching, that codependency piece. But take care of yourself. Do something that you enjoy. If you're married, date your spouse again and talk about something besides the addiction.
I love
The
that.
elephant in the room. Yeah. So I'll stop there. Those are some good tips for loved ones.
Thank you so much. And it's so much more impactful hearing that from you, because as you told your story, it really was your wife's willingness to really do that work for herself and understand how she needed to look after herself and be a positive support that ultimately led you onto the path of recovery.
That's right. And just a note on that, we may be close to time, but I do want to share, we've mentioned 12-step and AA. If you're interested in Alcoholics Anonymous and the 12 steps, do a little bit of research. When Love Is Not Enough is a great video. You can find it on YouTube for free. And it's the story of the founder's wife of Alcoholics Anonymous. And it's her journey as the wife of this alcoholic, Bill Wilson, who had found recovery. And she's like, well, what about me? because they
Wow.
didn't have Al-Anon back in the day. This was in the 30s and 40s. And so they started meeting with each other, the spouses did, and they developed a program for loved ones who suffered from alcoholics behavior and all the crazy stuff that we do and the way we damage relationships. So absolutely. And then for myself, why I love to talk about the other side is because once I started sponsoring other people in 12-step work through Alcoholics Anonymous, I thought, this is insane. We are crazy. Because I had a pretty peaceful, serene life. I was like, things are good. They're clicking again. And then enter an alcoholic into my world that's active. I'm like, no, gosh, this is terrible. And so I enrolled myself. I went to Al-Anon meetings and worked through the steps on that side. And it really is two sides of the same coin. They belong to each other, and they really work well together.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. And I think sometimes people who have no understanding of the 12 steps also don't realize that it is so much more than a substance. Like really, that doesn't even, you're not sitting around talking about alcohol. It is so much deeper and more complex. And I don't think anyone could go through that process of working those steps without coming out feeling like a more whole and fulfilled person.
Absolutely. As a sponsor who was kind of following me along and was grateful that I finally was getting the program, meaning maintaining a little bit of sobriety and working through the steps. He asked me how I was doing one day, and I said, well, and he said, well, good for you. You know, I've tried to do what I can with the steps with you, and I'm glad that it's starting to work. And he said, just goes to show you that a trained monkey can help you get through this once you're ready.
Mhm.
And so it really just takes enough willingness, enough readiness. If you're listening to this and you're like, man, I just haven't had my bottom yet, or I haven't been low enough in my addiction, maybe you have. Maybe it's just addiction saying, I want to do this some more to you. And maybe you've got another story to tell. And so, whatever that level of care is for you, residential treatment, therapy, maybe you're sober curious, or you're in recovery, keep reaching out for help and getting the support. It's there all around the world.
Thank you. And you spoke about arriving at spiritual freedom or feeling that spiritual freedom. And that is just that was such a powerful way to describe it, because really, addiction, it's like you're a prisoner and you're really held and gripped by something. So what does, just to kind of wrap this up, like what does spiritual freedom, what does freedom from addiction feel like to you now?
I literally just got tingles, right? Because I love that question so much. It's one of my favorite realizations and continuing points of gratitude in my life. So a story came to mind. It's very short, but in one of the meeting houses for AA that I used to go to regularly in another town in Oklahoma, um, you hear this at AA around the world, I'm sure, in all the languages, but goes something like this. Um, I was so selfish as an alcoholic or an addict. I used to just do whatever I wanted to do. I only thought about myself. And now I get to live a different kind of life. It's not all about me. Which there's a part of that I found that another member, I'd never heard this from somebody until that point, that he objected to for his own experience. He said, well, I'm glad that some of you got to do whatever you wanted to do, because when I drank, I didn't know what I was going to do. And that's not what I wanted to do. And I thought, I like what he's saying, because I was starting to have some spiritual awakenings. I was able to think more clearly. I was able to process reality a little more accurately. Um, and so, yeah, that was part of my awakening into this freedom. I thought, wait a minute, what he said, because it was living a kind of life that I didn't want, doing things that I didn't want to do. Maybe there was a few years where I thought, ooh, whatever I want to do, the sky's the limit, me and alcohol. But then it was like, no, it was like, I'm going to need to be hiding bottles around the house and in our storage container and driving while I'm drinking so that no one knows. All these really dangerous, dysfunctional behaviors. So yeah, for me, what spiritual freedom really means is that I don't have to be an active alcoholic today. I'm not an alcoholic in the sense that I'm not intoxicated today. I'm not wondering what I did yesterday and whether it was bad or tragic. I may forget what I did yesterday, but I know it was good or pretty good, right? It was probably a pretty good day. I could not say that during active addiction for years. And to be able to say that makes me not want to drink for the rest of my life. I don't know that that will be true, but just having that emotional, psychological freedom. This is going on 16 years in February in
Wow.
long-term recovery for me. Yeah. And
Congratulations. That's incredible.
thank you. And then, I finally at 16 years, that will be as many years as I was active in addiction. So I was active in addiction for 16 years. And if I continue doing what I need to do to stay in active recovery, then I will always have 1 year less in sobriety than the age of our youngest daughter because I missed her first birthday. Remember that? So freedom is being able to be connected with what matters most to me, present while I'm there, and grateful that I was. There's nothing there's no amount of alcohol or marijuana or any other things that I used to take that honestly could produce this kind of life. There's nothing that could get me there. And I still know what it means to be addicted. I remember, I know what it is. And so freedom is being able to choose the kind of life or be able to respond to life as it is in healthy, wholesome ways and look back at the end of it and say, you know what, that was worth it. And that's what I want to go out saying when it's time for me to go.
Well, that is so powerful. And you are such a living example and inspiration of what's possible in recovery. So thank you so much, Charles, for sharing your story and for so much insight and inspiration. And is there anywhere for people who wanted to connect with you that you'd like us to, I can add it all in the show notes so it's linked, but for people who want to learn more about your work and what you do, what would be the best way to stay in touch?
Well, they might be able to find me someday post COVID at an international yoga retreat of yours somewhere. So I'm really
Oh,
interested in that.
amazing.
That would be fun. Yeah. So I'm serious about that. But yeah, in terms of my work, yeah, folks are interested in connecting with me just to learn more about me or to talk, or yes, if you want to find out more about recovery coaching or life purpose coaching, please do. The name of my business is Full Integration Coaching. Full Integration Coaching, and my website is that. It's www.fullintegrationcoaching.com. And my specialty is empowering passionate difference makers to find and fulfill their purpose, whether that's the purpose of a lifetime or the purpose for this time in life. So I work with folks in and out of recovery and all points in between, and a lot of leaders, a lot of folks that have been through addiction and want a better life. And so fullintegrationcoaching.com. My handle on Instagram is Full Integration Coaching. My Facebook page is Full Integration Coaching. So you can find me there too. Yeah, I look forward to connecting with any of you.
Well, thank you so much for your time. And I'm really looking forward to staying in touch and definitely for that yoga retreat. I think recovery retreats are definitely in the future. So
Yeah.
that will be a really nice way to connect.
Okay. Well, let's plan on it.
Okay. Thanks, Charles.
Okay. Thanks, Mary.